Welcome to Driven. I'm your host, Paul Perrone. We're going to learn and talk about AI, robotics, autonomous vehicles, and so much more. Check us out at driven.show on the web and give us a thumbs up or subscribe here if you like the show. So kick back or buckle up and become driven. All right, welcome to this episode of Driven. This is episode 2. This is an informational episode. So we're going to talk about what really is an autonomous vehicle. What really is an autonomous vehicle? What does that mean? I'm asked that question on occasion, and I really think it's just that people don't know. People don't know what an autonomous vehicle is. Now, some do. Many of you who are already in the autonomous vehicle space clearly know what an autonomous vehicle is. But it strikes me as funny to think about the word autonomous on occasion because I think back to, I think it was 2005. I was preparing for the first DARPA Grand Challenge, and there was a U.S. representative, a congressman from our district here in town. We invited him out to come check out our first autonomous vehicle, Tommy. This was 2005. Again, being readied for the 2005 DARPA Grand Challenge. And I had told him all about how this vehicle was autonomous, gave him sort of a big intro, a little dog and pony show, and then 30 minutes into the discussion and presentation, now he was very polite and listened very carefully to what I was saying. But he asked, okay, so are you going to get a joystick and remote control this thing now? And that's when I realized that people don't necessarily know what the word autonomous means. That was an interesting episode of my life, gearing up for the 2005 DARPA Grand Challenge, one of the first autonomous vehicle challenges to create a vehicle that could self-navigate across the Mojave Desert in this case, holding out a $2 million prize for the winner by DARPA, an arm of the Pentagon. But this congressman's eyes lit up when we did in fact run the vehicle on my property just outside Charlottesville, Virginia, with nobody on board, no driver behind the wheel. It was quite a sight to see this silver egg-shaped vehicle careening through my side yard here in the outskirts of Charlottesville, Virginia, with nobody on board. But since that time, I've given a lot of thought over the years. It's been 20 years since I've been working in the space, thinking about and working on autonomous vehicles and the different levels of autonomy, which we'll talk about. But one of the first points of confusion that I think I remember encountering early on is the difference between automation and autonomous. What is it? Are we creating automated vehicles or autonomous vehicles? And the SAE, that's short for the Society of Automotive Engineers, has something to say about that and these levels, and I'll talk a little bit about that too here shortly. As do others in the space, have different perspectives on levels of autonomy. But the way I think of it is that automation can really be thought of very simplistically in terms of what we might call a finite state machine. Now, in episode 1, in our conversation with Nolan Bushnell, if you've seen the episode, you heard him referring to finite state machines with respect to how the programming of games took place back in the day, back in the 70s and 80s when he was working on such things. And what a finite state machine really is its logic and memory. Logic taking inputs from the outside world and maybe some information that's stored in memory and making a decision or calculating something that should take place next. That generates next an output that could be delivered to something like a screen or in the case of autonomous cars, a steering wheel or something like that. So that's a real abstract kind of representation of what at least I think of and some others think of when they think of automation, a finite state machine automaton. So automation really is just taking inputs, generating outputs, making some decisions along the way. And in many ways, this is like a robot. A robot is the one way that you can think of a robot anyway is that you sense something from the environment, inputs, you plan, you make some decisions, that's like the logic and some memory, and then you act, right, on the environment, and that's like your outputs. So it's very much like a finite state machine. You get some input, you apply some logic, incorporate some memory, which is the planning, and then you output something, right? And for a car can said to be automated these days too. Certainly there are automated functions like cruise control. Let's say you provide an input at 35 miles an hour. The car then gets its current speed reading from a sensor, and it regulates the speed of the vehicle based on that. It will maintain whatever desired input speed that you gave it by regulating the throttle or the accelerator in the vehicle and the brake in your car, perhaps, to kind of maintain that input speed that you've given it, making sure that it doesn't go above that speed or too far below that speed before it gives it a little gas or maybe slows the vehicle down a little bit. So those are automated functions in your car. So then what is autonomous? What's the difference between automation and autonomous? And I guess when we think of autonomous, we think of something that's a little different. So what's the difference? We think of something that's more self-directed without any human intervention or human involvement in many cases. It's off on its own. There's a robot cleaning your house. There's a robot mowing your lawn. There's a robotic arm in a factory assembling things and spray painting vehicles. And in some cases, there's human intervention in these applications, of course. And that's where we talk about levels of autonomy. But fully autonomous is you set this machine off onto a mission. It goes about its hopefully merry way, and accomplishes the mission or the goals that you give it to achieve. And so we say it's autonomous. It's in the case of autonomous vehicles, this is really thinking of in many ways full autonomy. You tell the vehicle that you want to go to a Starbucks, some location on the map, and you might be at your home and you get in your vehicle and your car autonomously drives you all the way there. There's no, in this idealistic sense, involvement of you in any way aside from just being a passenger and the vehicle safely getting you there. And that's what we think of when we hear the term autonomous vehicles nowadays. It's this idealistic version, but there's really levels of autonomy. And as I'll mention, there's also domains of autonomy. What might be considered driverless vehicles or autonomous vehicles. We're thinking about ground or land-based vehicles, cars and trucks, and other types of vehicular platforms that are running on the ground, traveling in and amongst traffic with humans, or with in the case of like maybe a logistics yard or something where it's fairly sparsely populated with just more goods than humanity. But certainly in the case of self-driving vehicles or autonomous vehicles in and around transit spaces or public spaces, there's human beings and cars and dogs and cats and deer and all kinds of things, right? So that's one domain of autonomy, the ground. And I happen to think that's probably one of the most complex domains, but there's also the air, right? You may have heard of drones. These are aerial vehicles. They're operating in some cases without human intervention and in some cases with, but it's in the sky. And then you have automated or autonomous underwater vehicles like submarines and sub-like vehicles that are submersed below the surface of the water. And then you have surface-based vehicles like boats and other vehicles that can be autonomous or automated, operating on the sea or the lake or an ocean. And then you can sort of take it outside of our earthly environment into the extraterrestrial domain of space, and you have autonomous and automated vehicles operating in outer space, and sometimes, such as the Mars rover, on a different planet, an extraterrestrial surface, instead of what we have here operating on the ground in Mars. So it's operating on a ground, but not our ground, right? So those are some of the domains of autonomy. So we've talked about autonomous in the context of something that's self-directed without human intervention. But is there any in between no autonomy and full autonomy? And the answer is, of course, yes. There's some things that happen in between. And right now, the Society of Automotive Engineers, and I was proud to be the chairman of that committee when it first started, the On-Road Automated Vehicle Standards Committee, to define the levels of autonomy for autonomous automated vehicles. And they defined ultimately 5 levels. There's the 0th level, which means driver. And then there's a couple levels in between that deal with partial automation, conditional automation, so different caveats with how automated the vehicle is. And then you get up to level 4, which has to do with something that's mostly automated, but mostly automated in a certain operational design domain. So it's autonomous with some constraints of what it can do in the domain in which it's operated. It can do certain functions, but when you go outside of that envelope of the domain that you've defined, it might be a physical domain or just sort of a functional domain, a human has to take over. Level 5 in the SAE vernacular of autonomous levels, automated vehicle levels, is really no human intervention at all. It's truly fully autonomous in any environment, no matter where you're going, where you're driving, what condition that you're in. And so that's one way to classify autonomy that's popular in our autonomous vehicle space as defined by the SAE. But then you sometimes hear about teleoperation, meaning like remote control of a vehicle. You might think of it as RC control if you've done an RC car, but it's a little different than that. It really involves controlling a vehicular platform in this context from a remote location where you may or may not have line of sight to the vehicle. In many cases, you don't have line of sight with the way teleoperation in these vehicles is being applied today. But you have cameras outside of that give you a view of what's going on outside of the vehicle, and you're remotely controlling the vehicle. And in the cases of like the Mars rover, they'll sort of plan a number of things and upload a program as to what the robot should do that day, and maybe it'll move a couple of feet, it may move a couple of yards or something like that, and then the next day or the next hour, after a new mission is uploaded, the vehicle will move forward a little more. And this is to take some precautions so that it doesn't go rolling off of a cliff or something like that, because it's obviously not easily retrievable at all, recoverable, I should say. So it's kind of like a hybrid mode of autonomy. We can't teleoperate it in real time. We just don't have the bandwidth necessary to do that here from Earth, to control something all the way up on Mars. But we can give it a little mission, a micro mission, to make sure it doesn't go into a ditch. And then it does a little bit of that mission, stops, and waits for the next set of instructions. And the same methodology can apply to robots that are, and vehicles that are here on Earth, right? You may have a vehicle that's mostly autonomous, and then it reaches a stopping point where it doesn't know what to do. It says, hey, I'm stuck here, calls back to headquarters. Someone at headquarters might take a look at the cameras outside of the view of the vehicle and then take control of the vehicle, make it do something, give it a nudge. So so that's teleoperation. There's also ADAS, Advanced Driver Assistance Systems. And you have that in cars right now that do things like forward collision warnings and avoidance. If there's something in front of your vehicle, it will detect that and slow down and help you avoid colliding. There's lane keeping, where it's looking on the side of the road and helping you stay on the road, especially if you're falling asleep. It'll give the steering wheel a nudge and maybe wake you up and keep your vehicle in the lane. Adaptive cruise control is a form of ADAS. Adaptive cruise control is an extension of cruise control that you're used to, but in addition to setting a set speed and maintaining that speed, if you come upon another vehicle in front of you, it will actually detect the speed of that vehicle in front of you, calculate a safe braking distance behind it, and keep your vehicle behind that vehicle at a slower speed without getting too close to the vehicle in front. And then if that vehicle in front of you accelerates, goes faster, or goes out of the way, your vehicle will speed up, but maybe not beyond, or certainly not beyond, your set speed for cruise control. So that's a form of ADAS functionality in vehicles. And some of these things may fall into level 2, level 3 autonomy in the SAE classification of such, but they're still not fully autonomous functions. They're assisting the driver in making life a little safer for your journey home, to work. And then again, there's level 4, which is full autonomy in a certain specified envelope of operation. Level 5, where you're fully autonomous, operating anywhere, anytime. Now, when people also hear of autonomy and autonomous vehicles, they'll very often just think of the vehicle that they know about. They'll think of the Tesla. Oh, that Tesla's got autopilot. It's got full self-driving capability. So you've heard that term as it relates to Tesla and its ability to operate autonomously. It's really actually very sophisticated ADAS. It's not truly fully autonomous in the level 4, level 5 sense yet right now, as of the date of this podcast. It can work well in certain areas, and in some cases, as we've seen, unfortunately, there have been accidents and situations where it didn't do what maybe the user was expecting it to do, even though they may or may not have had their hands on the wheel or were fully alert. So you just don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different situations where these accidents have occurred, but nevertheless, Tesla is a classic example of a vehicle platform that people think of when they think of autonomy. So you're talking cars, and then of course, it's not a big jump to start thinking of SUVs and trucks and then vans and maybe larger transit vans that can carry 12 to 20 people, buses, 40-foot buses that can carry a lot more people. And then there are other even larger vehicles like tractor trailers and mining trucks, really any kind of vehicular platform. And then on the low end, maybe micro transit like golf carts and scooters or such. But these are all different types of vehicles that can all have autonomy. And then within that, there are certain classes of vehicle. A lot of vehicles, at least in the US, operate under what's called FMVSS compliance. That means they've been certified for federal motor vehicle safety standards, compliance to operate on public roads, according to US laws and regulations. So any vehicle that you would typically buy that you see now running on public roads, human driven, is certainly certified as FMVSS compliant, most likely. And this helps guarantee certain safety standards and conditions are met. For even crashworthiness is another important factor, right? But along the way, as autonomy started to move forward, the people sort of in the design space of vehicles, people who design vehicles, got a sense for, oh, there's this autonomy thing coming, and there's this whole new way that we can start thinking about redesigning the passenger experience, right? We can take the steering wheel out of the vehicle, we can turn the seats around, create more of a home-like or office-like environment. And in some cases, these vehicles start to look like, shuttles, right? Where they have benches on the side and you're sitting sideways in these vehicles. And you'll hear about autonomous shuttles occasionally in the news, and a lot of custom vehicles that we call bespoke shuttles or bespoke autonomous vehicles, because they're custom built with the idea that this is maybe what the future of autonomy could look like. And almost all of them are electric, because a lot of people think that electric's the wave of the future for a lot of good reasons for these vehicles. And if you're building something new, why not build it electric? So you see a lot of electric custom or bespoke shuttles that make the news because they typically look very cool. They look very interesting, futuristic vehicular platforms. But some of them also, unfortunately, made the news because they don't work particularly well. They're not designed to be FMVSS compliant. You have to get special waivers to even get some of these vehicles into the country. We were in our own endeavors shocked to find, well, I don't know if shock's the word, surprised, I guess, to find that we had a bespoke shuttle in our possession, and we were in the process of making it autonomous. But then before we could even really run it, we had to export it from the country through Canada and then re-import it into the United States so that we could get what's called a Box 7 waiver, which means that we can now operate this vehicle to run in still very specific situations, potentially on public roads, but with authority from NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Authority. And so you'll see a lot of these bespoke, we call them bespoke box shuttles because they're typically box shaped, and they look bidirectional. They might not actually be bidirectional. In fact, they often aren't, but they look it. And they've got this boxy shape, and almost inevitably, they're going about 7 miles, 10 miles, 12 miles an hour because of safety concerns. And a lot of them don't have the FMVSS compliance that we look for and other safety standards in roadworthy vehicles. But they're used in certain controlled environments and controlled fashions very often, as an example, autonomous platform. And then there's all kinds of other classes of vehicle by weight, by other types of standards, such as by axle, car size, truck size, van size, really big van size, and you get on up to tractor trailers, right? But any of these vehicles are all platforms for autonomy. So when people think of what an autonomous experience is going to be like, if we talk to a customer, or if you talk to somebody, they think they're just going to get into these vehicles right now and they're going to tell it where they want to go, and the vehicle is going to navigate them at roadway speeds to wherever they're telling it to go at any time of day, and without human intervention, right? So there's this sort of idyllic view of, I'm going to get in this vehicle, I'm going to tell it to take me to Starbucks or the local bar, and there's no human intervention whatsoever. It's going to take me there. I can go anytime, anywhere, any place. And that's sort of what I think the expectation that has been set in industry to date, because that's also the future. That is what's coming. That's what autonomy is moving towards. And that's what in many cases we need and what we want. But the current autonomous reality is that many of these vehicles, especially those bespoke shuttles and other vehicles, there's going to be safety operators on board. You're going to hear the term safety operators throughout the podcasts, or safety ambassador, safety driver. These are basically people who are going to sit on board and take over the operation of the vehicle in the event of an unsafe situation, right? So this would be you in the Tesla. If you're keeping your hands on the wheel, you are essentially the safety operator. But in these larger vans and transit vehicles, there's, what was the shuttle or van operator is now the safety operator. They're just monitoring to take over. Or if the vehicle's not designed to handle a certain situation, you'll see some of these shuttles operating that can handle intersections very well. It's actually very hard to look far down an intersection and know that a car that's traveling 45, 55 miles an hour is coming, because your sensors have to look far down these intersections from different angles and such. So with a lot of these applications, some of these vehicles will stop, and the human on board will look both ways and make the decision if it's okay to go. And you'll see them press a button saying, yes, you can go forward. So all kinds of reasons why you're going to have a safety operator on board. But there's also ADAS, as we talked about before, which can be masked as autonomy. You might think it's autonomous, but it's really not. It's really just an ADAS function. And there was some confusion back in the day when Tesla was referring to their vehicle system as autopilot, and people were reading books and watching movies inside the vehicle, not paying attention. And unfortunately, there were accidents that happened, and it was because it wasn't fully autonomous yet. And now Tesla's maybe not be advertising that, but in some cases there's still an assumption, and people get used to it. They get too comfortable with this situation. And there's a gentleman by the name of Steve Schladover who came up with some chart. I'll have to find it and display it here. That showed that as you increase the level of autonomous capability in the vehicle until it's fully autonomous, people are going to be more likely to sort of zone out and just get used to the fact that the vehicle is operating on its own, and then they're not going to be paying attention at the right time when they need to, unfortunately. So in some cases, having more autonomy but not full autonomy can be worse, because people will just not be ready when the time comes to take over. And then there's also the other aspect of autonomous reality, is that some of these vehicles still will need teleoperation and remote control. You may have heard of the cruise vehicles, GM's cruise vehicles that are operating in San Francisco and also now in Austin, Texas. And there have been a couple of occasions where there have been traffic jams and these vehicles just come to a complete halt and they're just stuck there. Or there was a communications outage because there was a big concert, everyone was using their cell phone, and the network went down, and the ability to remote control these vehicles or something was compromised. And all these vehicles just kind of come to a grinding halt, and you couldn't teleoperate them, you couldn't get them out of this jam because there was no communication with the vehicle. But that implies that when those issues aren't happening, that someone back in Central is monitoring what's going on and is going to take over when needed, right? And so you might not know when you are in these cars if it's being autonomously driven or if someone back at headquarters is driving you at that moment, right? Unless they explicitly tell you that that's happening. You just don't know necessarily in the case of these vehicles, which have that capability, know that. So there's that current autonomous reality. Also, there's this concept of limited domains. I mentioned level 4 autonomy is fully autonomous in a specific operational design domain, and characterizing what that operational design domain can be very difficult. And you might say, well, it can travel in parking lots, it can travel around campuses or what have you, but some campuses are more complicated than others. Some campuses are in cities, some of them are in more rural locations. And if it's a city campus, it might be just as complicated driving there as it might be driving around a busy city, of course. So there are some advantages conferred to those vehicle applications where you can say, hey, this is the limited domain of operation that we're going to allow this vehicle to run in. This is the campus, but this is the campus with these specific characteristics. We can run in these residential communities, but residential communities with these specific characteristics, or downtown business district circulators that it might be operating just like a fixed loop or a fixed route. And you can do that. And what you typically do is you do a site survey to assess that specific environment, and then go through, you might call it a hazard analysis or a risk analysis, but in this site assessment to say, yes, in these situations, based on our examination of the site, the vehicle can operate fully autonomous, or we might have an issue in this situation and you're going to have a safety operator take over for phase 1 of operations, and then in phase 2 be able to handle it or something like that. We've seen those types of situations. So that's really, I think, accelerated practical autonomy in a lot of applications, because you can more safely deploy in domains that you can characterize. And as opposed to designing this thing to drive anywhere across the United States under any condition in any situation, you have something that's deployable now. Now, there's still going to be this situation of ramifications associated with whatever vehicle platform you select. There are these vehicles that I'm showing here, a picture of a Ford Transit van. These are known vehicular platforms that people can drive. Families can fit into these vehicles and operate on public roads. You can drive you and others from point A to point B, anywhere you want to go on these kinds of vehicle platforms, because they are FMVSS certified, they're crash worthy, and check all of the necessary boxes for something that you would want to use and operate in the public domain. And then you can also see in the lower right hand corner here a picture of one of these bespoke shuttles. This one happened to be made in France. It isn't necessarily designed to have satisfy any safety certifications to operate on public roads here in the United States. And you'll typically see these kinds of shuttles operating in that 10 to 15 mile an hour range. And the crashworthiness of these systems are unknown. They haven't gone through a lot of the testing that the FMVSS compliant vehicles have gone through, where they crash test the vehicles from various collision vectors. Every sort of known angle of possible collision is very often undertaken in the testing of the vehicles that are more broadly sold, because they can afford to do so, and then that the passengers can remain safe under these various conditions. Whereas with the lower volume production vehicles such as the bespoke shuttles, it's just not economically viable to go through and crash a bunch of vehicles and test it across all these different scenarios, and they're more really demonstrator vehicles. And then on top of that, especially lately, and I've been in the autonomous space for 20 years, and I've worked with gas vehicles in the beginning, and then there was a pivot. I actually got to work with Neil Young, great man, great human being, on his 1959 Lincoln Continental that he called LinkVolt. Also worked with a guy by the name of Jonathan Goodwin, another great guy, who converted that vehicle into an all-electric vehicle platform with extended range alternative clean fuel technologies to recharge the batteries in motion. And this was in like 2009 or 2008, I think it was. It was a while ago. But since then, really, the Tesla, and of course, Elon Musk deserves major kudos for what he's done to accelerate the growth of electric vehicles with that vehicle platform, is one that's operating on public roads, and now there's been a lot of efforts across manufacturers to make these safer vehicle platforms. There's been a whole slew of other companies and innovative companies that have created different types of vehicle platforms, ranging from retrofitting existing vans to creating completely new electric platforms that could be roadworthy, like the canoe vehicle that I'm showing here in the upper right-hand corner of this picture. But along the way, what we discovered is that a lot of these electric vehicles have quirks. And it's newer technology for some companies who are manufacturing these vehicles. And it can make a hard problem sometimes harder. When we're trying to do autonomy, we're just trying to create the autonomous driver. We're trying to take that driver who sits in the seat and replace that function of whoever's driving the vehicle, but maybe distributing eyes all around the vehicle, making it sort of a mega driver, driving from some 360-degree point of view perspective with eyeballs all around the vehicle, seeing things that a human being just sitting in the front seat couldn't see. But now, throw on top of that, electric vehicles, some of which are still kind of making their way in the world, and throw on top of that bespoke vehicular platforms like the shuttles that we were talking about, which are not even able to run on public roads. They haven't reached the certifications, and they don't have the crash testing and what have you. And all this can add up to making a very complicated problem harder. And I will say this here, and I'll be saying it again probably in this podcast. Creating autonomous vehicles is more complicated than rocket science and brain surgery. There, I've said it. I'm going to say it again and again throughout the podcast. And the reason why I say that is that people know how to make rockets, right? They are difficult to make, but they are being made, and they have been made. Brain surgery has also been performed for quite a while. It's a complicated process. It's a complicated activity that requires a lot of expertise. But where can you really find these fully autonomous vehicles that we talked about before on public roads? The answer is they don't exist at the scale that we're talking about in terms of the idealistic view of what an autonomous vehicle should be doing. We actually are creating, the brain that's going in the vehicle. So it is harder than brain surgery because we're creating the brain. You can't go out right now yourself and buy a fully autonomous level 5 vehicle and tell you to take it anywhere you want to go. Because this is, still a process in the making. So it's really never been done before completely. So doing that in a regular FMVSS compliant vehicle is hard, creating autonomy. Now layer on top of that maybe latest greatest battery technologies combined with new manufacturing processes, a new vehicle platform altogether, something very custom, although very cool. And it makes it nearly impossible sometimes. It just makes it very difficult. Not so much the electric vehicles. They're obviously more of a commodity item these days and becoming so. But the bespoke shuttles certainly, are a new thing. So what is an autonomous vehicle? Well, let's take a look at an autonomous journey revisited. Here's an autonomous vehicle taking a drive. All right, here's an autonomous vehicle taking a drive. Looks pretty good. No hands on the wheel. This happens to be in an all-electric transit van. And this van is operating in the beautiful state of Hawaii, stopping at intersections, driving down the road, cruising. Very uneventful. From the outside, you might not even know it's an autonomous vehicle unless it didn't have the signs and the wraps on the outside that say it's an autonomous vehicle. But on occasion, you're going to be taking over in perhaps vehicles like these in these environments. And this is a representative example of a really practical autonomous vehicle today, right? This exists and other vehicles like it. And in fact, there's a number of different types of autonomous vehicles, classes of autonomous vehicles. We've already talked about bespoke shuttles, such as the one on the lower left. We've also, there's also robo-taxis like the cruise vehicle in the middle, which is just really taking a regular vehicle and adding autonomy to it and scaling it in some way. There's ADAS in consumer vehicles like you see in the lower right there, just a representation of forward collision avoidance. And then there's beta autonomous driving systems like you have in, say, the Tesla, and what you might really call L4 ODD vehicles as well, as you see in the upper right-hand corner, meaning level 4 vehicles that can operate in restricted design domains, such as that transit van, which is the exterior view of what was driving around in Hawaii. So when you hear the word autonomous vehicle, don't necessarily think of the Cruise, robo-taxi, or just the Tesla, but keep in mind that there's all these other types of vehicles out there, vehicle platforms that people are referring to, and the different domains of operations and what they can and maybe cannot operate in. Then there's the tech inside. What goes inside these vehicles? In some cases, the autonomy is built by a manufacturer, and it's embedded in the vehicle right from the factory. And there are companies working on and doing that. And in some other cases, there are organizations who know how to do autonomy, but then they do a a very custom integration into a particular vehicle platform, and they make it autonomous with the custom platform. And then there's some companies that have kits, retrofit kits you might call them, or just aftermarket kits, methodologies which you take computers and sensors and controls and integrate them into any vehicle platform, or maybe a subset of some very specific classes of platform and make them autonomous. So I kind of like to separate these things out. Think of autonomy separate from the vehicle platform, separate from however it's propelled. So there's going to be a lot more that we're going to talk about in the future. This is really just an introduction episode, and it was an informational episode about autonomy, about what it really is, an autonomous vehicle, and what's really out there right now as of today, September 2023. Things may be different a year from now if you watch this video, but that's where we are right now. And hopefully we're going to see more in the coming year with more and more safe, reliable autonomy that can be put to practical, real use and do real things for people now. And we're seeing some of that. And there's a couple of companies out there doing that. And we're going to talk a lot more about autonomy moving forward. We're going to dive deep. We're going to talk about sensors. We're going to talk about controls, behaviors, path planning, lane keeping, parking. What does all that mean? Methods of autonomy. What is a rule-based system versus a neural network-based system? How does GPT factor into all this? And just a lot more. We're going to talk about autonomy from soup to nuts. And at the end of this podcast, if there is an end, and there will be at some point, but if you listen to every episode, hopefully you'll know how to maybe build an autonomous vehicle yourself, or with an organization, or know how to manage a company or an organization that's building them. Or you'll feel more comfortable getting into and knowing about the autonomous vehicles that you're experiencing as a consumer or as a user of these systems. So I hope you enjoyed the show. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Driven. I hope you enjoyed the show Driven with me, Paul Perrone, your host. Don't forget to check us out at driven.show on the web, and give us a thumbs up or subscribe here if you like the show. Thank you for listening in. See you soon.